Rishi, Namaste. Thank you for coming, inviting us. And there is few questions we want to ask. So could you tell us, please, how you, what is inspire you and how you get there? What was time when you have this inspiration, and if there was time when you have just a normal life and you was not thinking at all about spirituality?
Well, I can say that I was inspired from quite a young age, and so it seemed as though always inside there was this searching. But you asked if I had some sort of a normal life, and the answer to that is yes, because I grew up in the West, and so just normal childhood and challenging sometimes, but not an unusual childhood. But I became curious at a very early age. So by the time I was in my teens, I was already attracted to statues of the Buddha and Hermann Hesse's book, Siddhartha, things like this. By the time I was 14, 15, I was already looking at these things, but not with I didn't know at that time that I was seeking. I just was interested in these things. But a real turning point came when I was about 15, and I was doing some research in the library at the school that I went to, and I came across a copy of Ahimsa by Mahatma Gandhi, which was the first book that came to America, I think, of his teaching and philosophy. And somehow I found this in the school library. This was the only book in there, I think, that was like this. Somehow it was placed in front of me. And this was what I really believe it was the turning point, because from then on, whenever I read this book and Siddhartha and became interested a little bit in the Buddha. So from this point on, whenever I came across anything in the realm of Eastern or Indian spirituality, I was immediately attracted to it. So this inspiration came somehow from inside.
Do you remember what has inspired you there in these books?
Well, in terms of ahimsa, this Sanskrit word means non-harming. You can say in English, you can translate it into non-harming. And if you remember, this was during the time where the Vietnam War in America was raging, and it was raging in Vietnam, but in America it was a big, there was a lot of protest and a lot of disturbance, and Martin Luther King had, his movement had arisen in America, and he was promoting Gandhi's work, which is how I think it ended up in this book, Ahimsa, ended up in the library. This was before he was assassinated and before the American people rose up and had the Vietnam War stopped. This didn't happen until 1972. So the time I'm talking about is more like 1962. So the war was going already, but it was a hidden war. But somehow I knew about it. And so I was just really attracted to these ways of peace. So the images of the Buddha sitting in meditation, Gandhi's words about the use of non-violence as a way of creating social change. And of course, the trials that Siddhartha underwent as he moved toward the realization of Buddhahood. Because I had a fairly difficult emotional life and a fairly difficult family life for me, not necessarily. I don't know how it was for other family members, but for me it was difficult. And so I could relate to his struggle and his desire to find peace in the midst of the challenges of spiritual life and spiritual practice and his life in the world. Because Siddhartha had been a householder who was compelled to leave his household, to leave his home, to leave his wife, to leave his child, in order to seek realization or self-recognition. And somehow I was inspired by this. So all of these things sort of converged within 1 year when I was about 14 or 15. All of these things came together at one time. And from then on, whenever something like that came up, I was distracted by it and inspired by it. So, as an example, when years later, I was caused to go into the army and I was sent to Vietnam. And the thing that impressed me most about the time there, I mean, aside from the difficulty of the situation, by then I already had several years of looking at trying to teach myself to meditate, because this was before there was very much in America. I knew nothing of Ramana's teaching, but still I was drawn to try to explore within myself even what was meditation and how do you do it. So I was sort of self-guiding myself. But when I got to Vietnam in the middle of the war, the things I was most impressed by were the temples and the Buddhist monks walking on alms rounds in the morning with the war going on all around them. And they were walking in this very peaceful and serene way, carrying their begging bowls. And so I was more impressed by the peace of these monks than I was, in the long run, than I was disturbed by the conditions of the war. Though the conditions of the war, it took me 10 years to get over that. But the way I got over it was I remembered the monks walking on the road or through the jungle going to the village and carrying their begging bowls barefoot, and the war going on around them. And their peace and serenity was, I just remember being 18 years old and seeing this and saying, hearing this voice inside my own heart saying, I want that. I want what they have. I don't care about this. I want what they have. So this was very inspirational for me. And after I came back, I went to university, I got my degree. And then once I was finished with that big project, which took 5 years, then I became very interested in spirituality and actually exploring. And eventually, I couldn't access any practice centers or anything. I was drawn to the teaching of the Buddha because that was what I was first attracted to. So at some point, I made the decision to leave my own marriage and to go to the monastery. So, following the example of Siddhartha in Hermann Hesse's book. Because I realized that I couldn't find what my heart was yearning for. And this was coming from somewhere deep inside, maybe from some previous experience or past life or something. This is what I know about this. And so, it was a very difficult way. It was painful for me, painful for my wife, but painful for my stepson. But I was compelled that I couldn't do anything else. At the time, I didn't know what I was looking for, so I couldn't quite say. I didn't have the benefit of being in India where, like Siddhartha was, where he could look around and see mendicants and sages and spiritual practitioners and having this long tradition. We didn't have that in America.
But you found there some Buddhist tribe?
Eventually I did. Eventually I did. After 10 years of marriage and living in the mountains of Oregon, and planting trees and living in nature, I knew that the next step was that I needed to find a monastic community where I could formally learn how to practice. And so that's what I did. I went to California. I left my marriage, I went to California. And it took me some time. I came into contact with Ramana's teaching, but I didn't understand it at all. It was very simple, very direct. And the Buddha's teaching is very precise and very complex. So they were kind of opposite sides, but I was attracted to both. The simplicity of Ramana's way and the Advaita way, and the complexity of the Buddha's way for the training of the mind, which was really necessary in my case because I had been through war, I had been through a difficult upbringing. I really needed to train the mind, and I was aware of that, I knew it. And I knew that that was the way the Buddha taught, so I spent 18 years in that tradition, learning how to meditate, how to look at things, how to let go of things, how to...
Could you say that all these 18 years you was very disciplined and good practitioner?
No. During that time, I was already a strong practitioner, but during those days I was still trying to, in some way, we can say, have it all. So I knew that I wanted to have children, and by then I was divorced, and I was already traveling around monastery to monastery, living in an intentional community. But I also knew that there was a strong desire in me to have children. So eventually I met someone in one of those communities, and we got married. We had 2 children. But now, I mean, then it became, working full-time at a very high-level job to support the family and support the household and things, and having 3 children at that time at home. And, but already at that early time, I was aware very quickly that I didn't know that this was happening. I was looking back on it. I realized that what I had done was I had just stepped into family life, living just a few miles from the monastery I was practicing at, as a lay practitioner, not as a monastic. And I knew that there had to be a way in which I would use everything that was going on, whether it was my work or the family or having children or, buying a house and all of that. I knew that there was a way that somehow I needed to find a way to be able to do all of that and continue to practice. And I had built a practice room in my house for myself, and I used to often meditate through the night there. Yeah. So it was something that was inside of me, so over the years it just sort of built up. It just kept coming out. And then when that marriage came to an end several years later, though, I mean, it was really clear, and my wife at that time, she even said to me one time, a few years later, that it was clear to her from early on in our marriage that the only thing that really kept my attention for very long was meditation and spiritual practice and study, because I had a strong scholarly outlook, so I was constantly, when I wasn't busy and so on, I would stay up half the night reading and meditate through the night and just get up and go to work the next day. Well, for a long time I was trying to do both. And so for me it wasn't about a rising in desire and then a lessening of desire, because there was always this strong desire to study and to practice and to try to live the principles of Buddhism in my job, in my career, and in my family. But ultimately, the amount of time I spent away from the family and away from what you might call an ordinary family life. This took its toll on my wife. And so I didn't realize that at that time. I realized it later. So at one point we left California and we moved to Montana, and when we did that, it became really obvious that I was headed in this direction and she was headed in this direction. So that went on for a couple of years, and then she finally moved away. Because I was quiet all the time, I was always meditating, I was always silent, I was always walking in the forest, I was not in that relationship and in the way that she wanted me to be. And she was not in our marriage in the way that I wanted her to be, which was I wanted her to be as devoted and as dedicated to the practice and the way as I was. So that was kind of where we had to go our separate ways. Yeah. So at the time that my wife left, I didn't have a strong emotional reaction to that. It was more, oh good, now I can meditate, Now I'm not encumbered by that anymore. And this came because I had this understanding, the Buddha was married when he finally abandoned the householder life. But the thing was that when before he abandoned the householder life, he had named his son Rahula. And Rahula in Pali means the fetter. The fetter is a binder, like a rope that you tie. And so he named his son. And so he had already realized at that point that this wife and family and his father's kingdom and everything that had kept him there in his father's pleasure garden, these were the things that bound him. So it was that kind of realization for me, because I had the inspiration of the Buddha's teaching. And while I felt that family life was a binder, I was not willing to leave it, because I also had a strong loyalty to family. I came from a big Italian Catholic family, so there's a strong loyalty piece in that kind of a family. So I wasn't ready to leave. But I also was not fully in the relationship, in the marriage, so she did me the kind favor of leaving, of saying, this is not what I want and I'm going. And it was challenging because we had children. But as it turned out, a few months after that event happened and a few months of silence, of meditation on my part, the children came to live with me. So I was right back in that situation again, where I had the opportunity to continue to practice and to meditate, but now I was a single parent. But in many ways that was easier. It was still one less person to have to interact with in some way. In some ways that was easier, and because by that time I was financially secure and had some success in my life because I had a career. But I had become very ill during that time, so I was also beginning to deal with illness at that time. And but I was in a situation where I didn't need anymore to go out to work. So that gave me the opportunity to raise my children, which fulfilled that loyalty, familial obligation kind of feeling. And I could meditate all through the night if I wanted to, or I could do what I needed, and then I could just help them. They could go out to school in the morning. I would have the whole day to myself to look after the house and look after the laundry and do those kinds of So I was living the life of a monastic while I was in the world, but I wasn't really in the world. I was basically home as an in-house monastic. And my children were coming and going in that scene. And so we had an hour in the morning, and they went off to school, and and they were doing their activities throughout the day, and they were coming home at night, and then we had an hour or so at night, and we were doing our family life that way, and of course doing some things on the weekend, some family kinds of things, but mostly I was living kind of a monastic lifestyle. I was also quite ill at that time, so this kept me very focused on meditation practice and on the coming to the recognition in the Buddha's way of saying it that there is an end to suffering. So I was continuing to work in that way. But by then I had also come into contact with Ramana's teaching and his very clear admonition that we are not the body. And so this gave me a great deal of power and strength and resiliency to go through several years of really difficult physical problems and to engage in this I am not the body idea, which then naturally leads to, if I am not the body and I am not the mind, then who am I? And so I slowly transitioned from the Buddha's teaching more into Ramana's teaching and was practicing more in that particular advaita frame of reference. Still using the Buddha, what I'd learned over 18 years as a Buddhist practitioner. I had become a Vipassana teacher by then. So, but then I dropped that as well and decided to concentrate for a number of years, 10 years or so, on Ramana's teaching and was practicing in that way. So. And I wasn't teaching anymore. So.
Do you have during the Buddhist practice any attachment to the spiritual experience?
Yes.
Maybe you can share that, if there's any.
Well, all along the way, for anyone who's engaged in spiritual life or in spiritual practice or spiritual endeavor or sadhana or whatever you want to call it, or the different traditions call it by different names, there are quite naturally, when you engage in long periods of meditation, and remember I was quite ill, and one of the ways that I dealt with that was that I would just increase the amount of time I could meditate because I didn't feel good. So I learned to watch the way that sensations and feelings and emotions come and go, but my body limited what I couldn't run away from them. So I can't, the time in my life when I could run into pleasure, run into relationship, run into alcohol, run into drugs, that just had to come to an end. Couldn't happen anymore because of the physical condition of my body. So I just learned to sit still, keep quiet, and watch, observe, witness. And I learned this through the Buddha's way, but that was very compatible with Ramana's way when I got to his teaching. So those two were the same. There was a continuity there that happened. And I just kept going, but my daily life really dictated in a way it dictated what my practice was like, because there was a certain rhythm that went along with having 2 young children at home and being a single parent. There was a certain rhythm that went along with that, and I just stayed in. I'm not sure, what was the question you asked me? I think I got distracted there. You can cut that out.
It's okay, it's good. Yes. And what happened when you meet Ramana teaching? How you move? They say there was you started to more experience the way I'm not the body.
Oh, you asked me about actually the spirit experiences that happen in spiritual life, right?
Yes.
That's where I was headed with that. So that's how that happened. Is I had been a strong practitioner for many years. I had come into contact with Ramana as a being through this picture that someone gave me when I was already at the Buddhist monastery. And I was really drawn to this picture. And so I kept it for many years. I still have it actually. And I kept it for many years. It was just a small bookmark for marking the place that you read in your book. So for years I kept it as my bookmark. So I was reading these Buddhist texts and looking at this picture. And there was a time when I was in this period of really difficult illness, when I had been sitting for many, many days, just taking care of my children when they were home, but literally been on retreat for probably months, but for many, many days in a period of intense physical pain and intense meditative absorption at the same time. And so there was a moment when there was just an inspiration that rose in me, and it was the question, who meditates? And this moment caused a radical shift in what I was observing. So before that time I was observing the pain, the situation I was in, the life that was around me. So still very much observing outside. But when this question arose in me, who meditates? That caused the attention which was normally flowing out into sensations in the body, experiences in the world, to completely turn and shoot in like an arrow. And this, I don't know what to say about it. In some way, this was the destruction of looking out completely. It just was completely gone. I couldn't find anything inside, but within a matter of just a few minutes, I don't know, maybe an hour, in this samadhi state, with this question driving itself into me, who meditates, who meditates, who meditates? There was this deep recognition that no one meditates. There is no one here. And yet, I am. This recognition of the self was there in that moment. And in that moment of recognition, this was a moment. I don't normally have moments. I typically sit for long periods of time and it kind of flows up and down. This was a moment. And it's a very clear moment. That when there was this recognition, this presence of only the self, this is all there is, everything else just sort of immediately dissolved, just shattered and fell away. And in my mind's eye, Bhagavan was standing in front of me. After all these years of not understanding his teaching, he was standing in front of my mind's eye and he said, "You see, I told you." And that was the change of my life, really. There were many changes before that, but that was the change. From then on, for the next 10 years after that, I stopped teaching. My children had grown and they were gone off to college. And I went first to Brazil and then I came to India. Because everything had come to an end. There was nothing left after that.
Could you say that from that moment, or maybe earlier, Bhagavan Ramana guided you in that spiritual life?
Bhagavan Ramana is the symbol of the search I had been on. So even now, I am completely devoted to him as my guru and spiritual teacher in the same way I'm devoted to the Buddha and his teaching. And I try to integrate both of those into the way that I share with people. Because I think there is value in both of them, and I think that without both of them, I wouldn't have understood the things that I've understood, and I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in now, sharing with people. But I don't consider myself a Buddhist, and I don't consider myself a Hindu. I don't consider myself an anything. So, what was guiding me to this moment? I don't know. I know it took the form of the Buddha, and I know it took the form of Sri Ramana Maharshi. This I know, no doubt. But it was also before them. It was guiding me back to this way of being. So, where that comes from, or you can say, was Sri Ramana guiding me? Yes and no, because yes, because the teaching guides me. No, because Bhagavan said, I am not the body. Not me, but him. He said, I am not the body, I am the self. So this tells me, and the Buddha also, when the Buddha was awakened, and people asked him who you are, he said, in Pali, he said, Bud, I am Bud. And they called him the Buddha, and to this day they refer to him as the Buddha. But he never said that, he never declared that. They said, who are you? He said, Bud. This word means awake. He didn't say, I am awake. They said, who are you? He said, awake. This is not different from Ramana saying, I am the self. This is the same.
I hear you many times saying to people, are you aware? That's why you use that sense.
That's why I ask people all the time, are you aware? Especially when people get, especially when people get really distracted by their own storylines. Because by asking this question, are you aware? And getting people to stop in the middle of their story and look inside to ask, am I aware? Yes. To know this, I am aware and here right now. They have forgotten their story. They had to look to see if they were aware. Well, this is not different from the Buddha looking inside, looking inside, looking inside, looking inside. It's not different from Ramana asking, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? It's keeping the focus on this presence which knows beyond any doubt that it is aware. And this is not a person. So Ramana would not say, he is the guru. He would say, he denied being the guru throughout his entire life. And he would say, you are the self. The guru is the outward manifestation of the eternal presence. In the Buddhist jargon, it would say that the presence is, the guru, the teacher, is the outward manifestation of Buddha nature. Not of the Buddha as a person, not of Ramana as a person, but of the Buddha as Buddha nature. That which is. And in the Advaita teaching, the presence, that which is, which Ramana refers to as the self.
Now you're saying like a Buddha and Ramana, it's sounds like a lot about the Jnani way, no? Do you have any part from the Bhakti way also?
I'm not a strong Bhakti person in the sense of what you can experience, for instance, here in India, with lots of ceremony, lots of temples, lots of beauty, lots of singing and chanting and so on. I was never really attracted to that way. But the thing I've learned over the years, or I've discovered over the years, is that it's the outward form of bhakti appeals to a certain practitioner or a person who has a certain emotional makeup. That appeals to them. For the jnani, it is the devotion to the self without any trappings, right? Without any ceremony, without the need for, without any color, let's say, without any color, over the course of 30 or 40 or 50 years, that shows the supreme devotion of the jnani, who is not. So the devotion is of a different nature. It's not an outward form. Yeah. It took me a long time after I first came here in 2007 to get used to, because I came from the Buddhist tradition and then from many years of Ramana's tradition. It took me many years to get used to the outward forms of bhakti, devotional practice. Now I love them and I enjoy them. And I often watch ceremony on my computer and things like that. And of course I go to the ashram, though not when there are 3,000 people there. I don't go during those times because I'm still a very silent and private and secluded kind of person. So I tend to go to temples and ashrams at times when there's very few people there. And I tend to still go, I'm still oriented toward quiet. not toward visual or sound kind of spectacle. So that's just my personal way. But I have a great respect for all the people who are following this bhakti path, and for Yogi Ramsaraj Kumar, for Ma Devaki, for the people who are part of that bhakti tradition, for Neem Karoli Baba, Krishna Das, Ram Das, all the people that are in the world living in this spirit of love, serve, and remember, as Neem Karoli Baba said, because this is also what the Yoni needs to do. This is what the Yoni does, but the Yoni does it silently, without anything.
That's maybe my question. If you experience this bhakti.
Yes, of course. How else would a person like me, who comes from nothing and knows nothing, and isn't attracted to the bhakti way, how else could you go on for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, unless deep within you there's a very pure kind of devotion that's happening. And it's not a devotion that needs flowers and pictures and song. All of that can be enjoyed, but it doesn't move me in the way that I see that it moves people who are part of the bhakti tradition. They're so moved and so into states of ecstasy. For me, the greatest state of ecstasy is to be left alone, sitting quietly somewhere and not disturbed. So it's just a, it's said in all the traditions that we wake up to who we are. We don't wake up to be somebody different. And I have been this way since I was a small child. My mother once told me, as years went by, she was describing me to someone else and I was in the room. And she said, he has been an old man since the day he was born. And what she meant by that was, even as a very young child, I used to sit for hours just doing nothing. Children play and run around. And I was the person who sat. I was that child that just sat on the floor and was lost in my own world, from the very young age. And I took this up at an early age. So even when I was like going to what we call in America high school, so it's a secondary school, even during those years, I was very busy and very active at school during the day. But when I would come home at night, I would close the door in my bedroom, and often I would not go to bed at night because I had things that I wanted to do. I was reading, I didn't know, but I was just sitting in the quiet, listening to a little music or something. But I wanted that quiet, dark, peaceful time when the world was asleep. I felt like that was my time. And my father used to come in and say, "Go to bed. What are you doing up still?" And if he came in late, and I would just sit up all night and I would read what I could find, often history and things like that, because I couldn't find very many spiritual books at that time when I was 14, 15 years old. But I would read Siddhartha over and over. I would read some of these other books that I had come, Ahimsa. I would read these things over and over. And then when the light came in the morning, I would just get dressed and go to school. And I wouldn't have slept for that night, or I wouldn't have slept for 2 nights or for 3 nights, because this was my time. And I didn't want, and I'm still that way. I'm still that way. Yeah.
Do you have any question?
It seems that you never moved. It feels you started and you're at almost the same place. Would you say that?
I started and
you're here, almost in the same place. Has anything inside you really changed?
what has changed is I no longer am interested in the desires and the kind of worldly pursuits that I pursued as a young man. That those are gone. Those left years and years ago when I really turned my eyes toward practice and toward monastic living as a single parent. So all of those things let go. I just let go of all of that. So the outward form of my life is very different than, say, the outward form of my life when I was 35. It's very different because now I just live fully as a monastic person. I live alone. I live outside. I don't live in monasteries anymore. I don't live in ashrams anymore. I live outside, but I live in the space of the ashram of the heart. That's where I live. And so wherever I live is the ashram. And I prefer to live alone. I prefer to live in the quiet and the silence of my own moment by moment experience. But there was a moment in my life where I really, really accepted that this was the life I wanted. And I was no longer interested. And it creates some difficulty for me because sometimes the people around me are much more ambitious for me than I am. And so people would like to have a bigger satsang or a bigger this or an ashram or a bigger that. And I don't have any ambition in that way. I'm not interested, really. And so I have a really strong commitment to being nothing and being no one and going nowhere. And a really strong commitment to being sure that when I leave this body, that there are hundreds or thousands of people who go on in their lives with the teaching, whether they remember me or not, whether they know that they heard a certain thing that inspired their life or not from this body mind. I don't care. I just want the teaching to go on. And this is what I do in service to all of my gurus, all of my masters, because this was what they all did. They all left nothing behind but the teaching.
Yes.
And so this is my commitment. So there was a moment, so this happened twice. The first time it happened because I was living in the Buddhist world, studying in the Buddhist world, practicing in the Buddhist world. And the teacher I was with at that time, I was managing retreats for her. So her parents had flown to Puerto Rico, and her mother had had a stroke there and had to go into hospital and was going to need to be there for several months before they could fly her back to the United States to get stabilized. So she called me and she said, you know this retreat we have, 2 weeks from now in this city in Montana? Yeah. She said, you go teach it. And I said, I'm not a teacher. And she said, just go. Even if all you do is ring the bell and
make people meditate.
Keep the talk go, and she said, you don't have to do a talk, you don't have to do anything. I said, okay. So I went, and of course, as it turned out, I enjoyed it, and people enjoyed it. And then from then on, I started getting invitations to come and teach. So that's how that happened.
And this was what year?
Oh. I'm going to say around 1993 or 4, something like that. And I had been already in a program at Spirit Rock Center in California, which was the place of Jack Kornfield and all of the people from the Bari Institute of Buddhist Studies. Some of them had moved to the West Coast, and they had built this beautiful meditation center. And I was already involved in their, what they called their Community Dharma Leaders program. So I was already going to get some preliminary training, just how to be a manager, how to handle a sangha on behalf of a teacher. And so I was already involved in that program. So this kind of was a natural outcropping of that. This teacher had wanted me to become a teacher. And so I was just kind of thrust into it. But then by 2000 and this experience I talked about of Bhagavan appearing before me and saying, you see, I told you. This happened around the year 2000, or I think around there. And so by then I had a Sangha of my own. And so I already was doing some weekend retreats and offering meditation in my home and things like that. But this was a turning point, this experience of being plunged deeply into the heart of being, deeply into the self, and realizing that there was no one here. And I began to share from that experience at these retreats, and it just wasn't received well. Because in the Buddhist world, when you teach, it used to be, not so much now, used to be you taught chapter and verse, so it's like you taught, very academic, very scholarly, and you talked about what your resources were and where the Buddha said this and where he said that. And I was teaching from a direct perception or a direct experience. And so this didn't really go over very well with some people. With some people it did. But for me, I felt the dissonance of it. And I also realized I wanted to explore Ramana's teaching more deeply, and my youngest child was going off to university. And so I walked away from the Sangha. And I traveled for a few years in a we call a camper. What do you call them? What are they called?
It's like a van, right?
Yeah, like it was a van converted to a house. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was traveling around the western United States, going to various Hindu temples and things like that. And I that's when I became attached to Neem Karoli Baba. And I was kind of, yeah. But then I was called to India. I came to India. Someone came to Neem Karoli Baba Ashram and said that she had a message from Ramana that the time was now and I needed to come to Tiruvannamalai, which I didn't know about. And she said she would make all the arrangements. She was living here, still lives here. And she made the arrangements for me at Ramana Ashram, and I came a couple of months later. So that sent me on a 7-year journey here of just practicing, of just living here, of not teaching, and just remaining like I live now, very quiet and not really wanting to teach, and doing lots of long retreat, 3, 4, 5, 6 months retreat. Just hiring people to bring food to the house every few days, like vegetables and things for me to cook, and just staying inside for many weeks or months at a time, or staying on the veranda, just living there, looking at the hill, and practicing the way of inquiry. And then I was diagnosed with cancer, and so I went back to the United States, and I was there for 2.5 years going through cancer treatment. And a very difficult period, again, that physical part, and being able to engage in this process of understanding Ramana's way of I am not the body, and who is this I, and understanding this, and this really deepened my understanding. So at the time, I had some experiences with that through being in the hospital and having surgeries and I've talked about this before, that this really made it clear to me that there is a direct knowing of being. Yes? We talked about this, you and I, yesterday. There is a direct knowing of being, which is not related to what you know with the mind. It's not a knowledge. It's a direct experience of knowing or being. And this became really solid and really clarified through 2.5 years of cancer treatment. I had throat cancer, so I wasn't able to speak. So I was definitely on silent retreat, living in my cave when I wasn't in the hospital and having surgery. And I was definitely, going through chemo and radiation and just living in my cave and living in the silence of being and doing this inquiry, this who am I question, and it really exploring, becoming to know very clearly and very intimately that we are not the body, and that the body can come and go. It doesn't matter. That it makes no difference. That being, that which is here eternally, never born. And having known that, what else is there to do? So after that period of time when I was released from cancer treatment and declared to be in remission, I came back to Tiruvannamalai. And I was just living over near Ramana old age home in a small flat in a beautiful big garden surrounded by forest and trees, just living very quietly. And then I had no intention to teach. I thought I would never go back to teaching. I didn't want to. I was just really happy, come face to face with your death, and in that moment of knowing that the body is dissolving, I remember saying to Bhagavan, okay, so yeah, take the body, but you said, I was really demanding, you said that if we penetrate through the I am the body idea, that we will know beyond a doubt that we are the self. So you can take this body, but before you do, keep your promise. It was like, I took that as a promise. So I feel like you promised to me that I would know that this journey would end before this body ended. And then you can have the body, I don't care, you can take it. But until then, I need this body to realize this. So when all of this happened, kind of in a moment, but I was just here living quietly and not doing anything, and just living here very quietly. And then Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar had another idea. So then I was pointed out by one of the swamis from Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar ashram. I was pointed out to some people who then came and started asking questions, and then Amma, who is the guiding light at Atiti ashram, she heard something from what this Swami said to her and to some other people about who he thought I was. And she took that up and she connected. She said, come. She called me and said, come tonight, I want to go to Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar ashram, and we want to listen to stories of Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar. Ma Devaki will be speaking. I said, okay. I showed up, we went there, and we went in, and she had already talked with Ma Devaki, and I sat down in a chair, and Ma Devaki said, I am not talking tonight, he is.
Oh, wow.
And so that's how all of this started. That's when I met her, that night.
Amazing.
And since then, yeah.
So this was like 5-7 years
5 years ago, I think. I don't know, 7 years
6
ago?
maybe.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And now we have the pleasure of
Mm.
having you.
And now we have.
Guruji, maybe you want to share one last thing people could do to live the life that you feel people should.
Yeah, I was talking about this a lot during this year's satsang season toward the end, and that is that the most important thing is that I find with myself early on and with Western people in general, people from countries outside of India, but even sometimes with people inside India who are growing up in the traditional Vedanta Hindu world, and that is that all of those traditions, all of those structures in the family life and so on, are all there over, hundreds or thousands of years of, in order to support the culture and support spiritual life. But the one thing that's overlooked, especially for Western people, is that many people have a strong, strong yearning to understand who they are, however they define that. And in the West, we tend to look to material goods, to experiences, to, we tend to throw off traditions. But we never ask ourselves, what is it that we really want? Because if people look very deeply into their heart, many people who are involved in spiritual life, they realize that what they really want is the peace and the understanding that come from spiritual life and spiritual reflection and spiritual practice. But they don't give themselves permission to fully embrace that. They feel like they have to meet their familial obligations. They have to get married at a certain age. They have to have so many children to carry the family line on. They have to, in the West, people feel as though we have to be successful in a particular way that's identified in the West in terms of materialism and things like that. And what gets lost in that is this question, what is it that I truly want? And so lately, in the last few months, I've really been asking people that a lot, People talk about their story and the challenge they're facing and the difficulties they face, both in their personal life and in their spiritual life. And it's a very direct question. Yes, but what is it that you really want? If what you really want is to awaken to your true nature, not to be somebody else, but who you are as being consciousness and bliss, then you have to ask yourself, who am I? Because when you realize that your heart's desire is to remain as presence, to remain loving, kind, compassionate, to know your heart's wisdom that is there naturally, then you pursue that in the midst of everything else, even if you have to have family life, even if you have to have a high-level career, whatever, you pursue that. Even if you are living on the top of a mountain in a cave, you pursue that with single-mindedness, and not just with the mind, you pursue it with single-heartedness, so that you know that this is the meaning and purpose of this incarnation for you. And it makes no difference what the outside looks like, what the world thinks of you, whether you are successful in the world or whether people think you are wonderful or not wonderful, people think you are, you just stay with it, no matter what the family criticizes you, no matter what the friends criticizes you, no matter who you leave behind because they can't understand. You just keep going toward this heart feeling that you are being consciousness and bliss. With certainty.
Single-heartedness.
Single-heartedness.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hari Om.
Hari Om. Tat Sat.